Hello, welcome to the book presentation of A Monetary and Fiscal History of the United States, 1961 to 2021. Today we are delighted to have Alan Blinder as our guest in the joint seminar of the School of Government and the School of Business of Universidad of Ibáñez. Professor Blinder is a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University. Previously, he was a member of the President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, and later a vice chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. He's also an opinion leader and one of the best writers in the subject of macroeconomic policy. We must thank the internet for the opportunity to have him here virtually with us. We're also delighted to have two excellent book discussants. First, we have Patricio Meller. Professor Meller has a PhD from UC Berkeley, and his book, A Century of Economic Policy in Chile, 1890 to 1990, is a must-read to understand Chile's economic history. Second, we have Elias Albagli. Elias is a PhD from Harvard University and is the director of the Central Bank of Chile's Monetary Policy Division. In other words, he's a central piece in the decision software that we call Central Bank of Chile. After the discussion comments, we will have a little bit of a Q&A section. In the bottom of the Zoom, you can ask questions, moderated by Andrea Repeto, our senior fellow at the School of Government. So please, Alan, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here in Chile with so little travel time. I'm going to share the screen. Let's see, put that up. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, here we go. So this is the book, A Monetary and Fiscal History of the United States, covering the 60-year period. Those of you who are familiar with monetary economics in general will realize that neither the title nor the coverage years are a coincidence. The coverage starts right where Friedman and Schwartz finished, and of course they called their famous tome A Monetary History of the United States. They did not deal with fiscal policy, but I do. And the reason, there are many reasons I do, but here's one very simple reason. I teach Economics 101, and we teach students in 101 that the macroeconomy sometimes needs to be stimulated because there's not enough demand, or restrained because there's inflation. And either monetary or fiscal policy in principle can do that job, which a naive thought would be they cooperate and they sort of share the task. Historically, however, that's very wrong. It's not always wrong, and I'm coming to that at the end, but it's generically wrong. And instead, there have been ebbs and flows of using monetary policy, using fiscal policy. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they conflict with one another, and that's a major theme of this book. So I'm going to concentrate today on the first theme, which is which of these two policies is sitting in first violin in this orchestra and which is relegated to second fiddle. And as I just indicated and will elaborate on, that's changed a lot over times. Second and third themes appear a little bit in this talk, much more in the book, about the changing attitudes about budget deficits, fiscal deficits, and about central bank independence, two issues that are still hot in many countries, including the US. So I start the story in a logical place when Keynes came to America. Now, it's important Keynes came to America. Keynes' general theory, of course, was published in 1936. The Swedes had been following what might be called Keynesian fiscal policies before that book was even published, but it was new in the United States. And it was considered a break from orthodoxy because when Kennedy advocated this tax cut, there was already a budget deficit, and those were thought evil. And the economy was recovering from a recession, not sliding into a recession. So this was unorthodox, to say the least. And as evidence for that, it really took the assassination of John F. Kennedy and a lot of arm twisting by Lyndon Johnson, his successor, to get this thing passed. I mean, just imagine that in the current economic environment. If a Democratic president advocated a big tax cut, are the Republicans going to try to block it? Certainly not these days. But it was a big deal then, a big departure from orthodoxy, and there was a lot of resistance. And monetary policy was practically an afterthought. It was an afterthought. It was supposed to just accommodate the fiscal policy. Here's an amazing quote that I dug up in researching this book that was in the Economic Report of the President in 1960, the year of the increase. And I emphasize two things in bold. It has been and remains the and the Federal Reserve System. You could stop at that. Wow, that's independent central banking? We don't see any joint declarations from administrations and the Federal Reserve anymore, and haven't in many, many years. But it was true then. That the nation should, now get this, depend on fiscal policy, not monetary policy, to carry the main burden of reducing inflation. It's totally unimaginable, I think, in almost any country, certainly in the US, that a proclamation of the administration or the Federal Reserve would say, or the central bank, would say that this is the job of fiscal policy, not monetary policy. It almost seems comical from the point of view of 2023. Continuing with that episode, what was called the Great Society Program of Domestic Spending and the Vietnam War in the mid-60s was leading and did lead to excess demand inflation. And that turned fiscal and monetary policy cooperation, which is where it started, into confrontation. Lyndon Johnson had a habit of inviting people to his ranch in Texas for a barbecue. And he invited Martin, and he, by all accounts, barbecued him in December of '65. He also asked his attorney general if he had the authority to fire Martin, which he did not. So this was a period of stark confrontation between the two. It eased a bit when Johnson finally requested a tax increase in '67, and Congress enacted it about 18 months later. It took a long time to get that through. Notably for this talk and for this book, this is 1968. That was the last time fiscal contraction was used to fight inflation. We have had other fiscal contractions, as you'll see, but they were motivated by bringing the budget deficit down, come hell or high water, whether the economy had inflation or a slump or whatever, not by fighting inflation. Next, we come to the notorious episode where Nixon basically took control of the Federal Reserve through his agent. It's an unkind word. Let's say his friend. That's what it says here on the first line. His friend, Arthur Burns. There's a lot of academic discussion these days about fiscal dominance. This was a very primitive form of fiscal dominance, which is just forget about the central bank being independent. It's supposed to do what the President of the United States wants it to do. So Nixon's program to get reelected in '72 was to combine highly expansionary fiscal policy with highly expansionary monetary policy, and Burns was on board with that. Just before and after the election of '72, we in the United States and the whole world experienced the first round of supply shocks. At first, they were limited a bit by price controls in the US, but then they burst into double-digit inflation. as the supply shocks got worse and the controls were lifted. So here's a graph showing you in blue the all items consumer price index inflation rate, and in red the core inflation rate excluding food and energy prices. And what you can see here in the 72.3 range, a big gap starts opening up and it continues for some years. Controls are being lifted right around this period of time. So it was a big deal. The supply shocks and the controls together were very big deals in moving the inflation rate during this time. Now, meanwhile, at the central bank, and this would be true of any central bank, but I'm focusing on the Fed, but central bankers in general around the world were befuddled by what was going on during that first round of supply shocks. They had grown up in an environment and had learned and taught that inflation and unemployment were not supposed to go up together. They were supposed to move oppositely. That's a Phillips curve. And they didn't quite know what to do. Are we going to fight inflation? Are we going to fight unemployment? Neither, both. There was confusion in the fiscal realm. It's quite interesting, a forgotten episode. Jerry Ford was president of the United States at that time. Nixon had resigned in August of '74. And one of the first things he did as the new president is ask Congress to raise taxes to fight inflation. Now, remember I said '68 was the last one. This did not pass. This did not get taken seriously. And just a few months later, he was asking Congress for a tax cut, which it did pass. I mean, look at this. This is October of '74 to January '75. It's a very short time to move from we should have contractionary fiscal policy to we should have expansionary fiscal policy. Monetary policy under Arthur Burns also vacillated. As I'm going to show you in a second on the next slide, the Fed funds rate drifted up, but only slowly until Nixon was reelected, then rapidly, and then it went down, up, down. Here it is. This is the first supply shock period, and what you can see is the Burns Fed is raising interest rates because of inflation, but slowly until the election of '72, then fast, then down, then up, then down, as it doesn't really know what to do with this combination of maladies, high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. Jimmy Carter follows Nixon, and remember there was a deep recession in '75, and I'll show you a graph. Bottoming out in '75, Carter believed the economy still needed a modest boost when he became president, and he proposed one, and Congress made it more modest, so there was a small fiscal stimulus. But both Carter's proposals and Congress's reaction to them were mitigated or moderated by the hatred of evil deficits. It's kind of a humorous afterthought to history that Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president against Carter in 1980, ran against deficits. One of the things he ran against was Carter was running these huge deficits. It sounds funny given what Reagan did when he was in office, but he did. Miller, G. William Miller, who was chairman of the Fed for a short time under Carter, has a very bad reputation for being very soft on inflation, and in part he deserves that. He was certainly no Paul Volcker. But I think it's notable to see, let's go back to this. This is the Miller period. He becomes chairman of the Fed here, and interest rates are going up, 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 up. Then comes Volcker. So there was a big difference between Miller and Volcker. But under Miller's chairmanship, the Fed did raise the funds rate by 450 basis points, which is not trivial. But it was nothing compared to what was going to happen. OPEC 2, as you know, struck in '79. And in August, I think it was, of '79, Carter replaced Miller at the Fed by Volcker. And importantly, he gave Volcker free rein to fight inflation, which probably doomed his reelection in 1980. There was also a short-term disaster with credit controls, causing a recession in 1980. I'll skip over that, because I want to get to the bigger story. The biggest clash between fiscal and monetary policy I think we've had in US history was Reagan and Volcker. So Volcker had started to tighten monetary policy more rigorously than Miller in the closing months of '79, allegedly converting to monetarism. I use the word allegedly advisedly. The Reagan tax cuts passed Congress, I think, in August of '81. They were phased in starting in '82. So you had tight money in place and then loose fiscal policy starting. The results of that policy mix were, first of all, well, let me skip to here. Textbooks tell you that should boost real interest rates, and if you're the United States, not all countries, if you're the United States, boost the dollar. Both of those happened. They don't tell you you should have a slump. That was mainly a matter of timing. Volcker had been tightening monetary policy since '79. The Reagan tax cuts only started in '82. So we had a severe slump followed by a boom. This was the Morning in America period that helped Reagan get reelected by a landslide in '84. And there were two legacies, at least two legacies of this period that lasted a long time. One was the legacy of chronic fiscal deficits for the next 15 years or so. The second was Volcker was, well, this is one of these questions, did he jump or was he pushed? It's not completely clear that Volcker wanted to stay on, but in any case, Reagan didn't give him the choice. And the next part of the lasting Reagan legacy was to put Alan Greenspan in as chairman of the Fed. George Bush, of course, the first George Bush followed Reagan in the White House. And during his presidency and after, this Reagan legacy of chronic deficits basically crowded out any thought at all about using fiscal stimulus to get out of a recession. And Bush had one in 1991. Fiscal policy at that point was about reducing the deficit and nothing else. I dug up, or my research assistant dug up, this quotation from the New York Times in December '91. Many of the president's economists, along with much of the economics establishment, note that, fear that economic stimulus of any kind is as likely to harm as help. Really? I mean, if you want to get out of a recession, is it going to be harmed by more government spending or a tax cut? As I wrote here, it's about as anti-Keynesian as you can get. Not for the last time. We're going to see attitudes like that in coming slides. So sticking with the Bush episode, Bush reluctantly agreed to raise taxes, which the Democrats had wanted him to do, in the budget agreement of 1990, which cost him politically, both inside his party and outside his party. Bush also agreed to put in the pay-go system, pay as you go, which was the sleeper in that agreement. Turned out to be there was hardly any attention paid to it at the time. Everybody focused on the tax increase, but was a big deal. And it helped reduce budget deficits in the coming decade and a half. A decade, let's say. The administration officials in the Bush administration berated Greenspan constantly for not easing monetary policy enough, and Bush himself wound up blaming Greenspan for his defeat by Bill Clinton in '92. Now, the Clinton administration was a big deal in terms of fiscal and monetary policy in two dimensions. The first one is up here now. Finally, the US government, it had started with Bush in 1990, but finally the US government got really serious about reducing the deficit, even though there were still nagging concerns about the strength of the economy. Clinton himself often spoke as if the fiscal multiplier was negative, which made the economists in the administration, I was one of them, wince. We liked what Clinton was doing, but we didn't like the notion that he was promulgating that you create jobs by reducing government spending or raising taxes. In any case, Clinton took the gamble that this would work, and it worked. Growth did accelerate because of what happened to interest rates, which I'm coming to. And so the legacy Bill Clinton left on the fiscal side was the opposite of Reagan, large budget surpluses, which we hadn't seen since the Eisenhower years. The second big break represented by Clinton was the rhetoric. If the Clinton policy was going to work, interest rates had to come down. So that meant either that the Fed was going to cut interest rates further. The Fed was already very low, with about a 0 real federal funds rate, or the bond market was going to rally. And that's what happened. The bond market did rally on the good news about the deficit. The Fed did not lower interest rates, but it continued its policy of forbearance for about a year into the Clinton administration, and then it stopped. Raised interest rates in February 1994. This was kind of a shot heard round the world. It was certainly felt in Latin America and many other places. In the Clinton White House, I was there at the time, the president became enraged. His attitude was, what in the world does Greenspan expect me to do? I just raised taxes, cut spending, took tremendous fiscal gamble, took tremendous political gambles to get the fiscal deficit down, and now Greenspan goes raising interest rates. He literally went into a rage in private, but in public, and this is the important thing, he didn't say a word to criticize the Fed. Instead, the mantra of people in the Clinton administration, I was one of them, anytime we got asked about the Fed, we said these 6 words and nothing else. We don't comment on the Fed. I can't imagine how many times I said that. Secretary of the Treasury said it 10 times more than I ever said it. I'm sure Greenspan appreciated this greatly. It didn't get remarked upon very much at the time, but it was a tremendous change from previous presidents, from Johnson through Reagan, through Bush the first, sorry, that had constantly criticized the Fed. None of that came from the Clinton administration. Clinton was followed, of course, by the second George Bush, who threw fiscal caution to the wind. The low deficit legacy of Clinton didn't survive very long. Instead, Bush pushed through Congress large so-called supply-side tax cuts, Medicaid, Medicare, Part D, a war, etc., paying for none of it, abolishing pay-go, and simply letting everything go into the budget deficit. And so the Clinton surpluses turned back into deficits quickly. That was at the beginning of the Bush administration. At the end of the Bush administration, the financial crisis struck the US and the whole world. And Bush turned again to a tax cut. It was a pretty small one. George Bush's attitude was, whatever the problem is, cut taxes. And so he did. And that, of course, was what Keynesian analysis would say. If you're running into a big recession, cut taxes. He did that, or Congress did that. And at the Fed, they dropped the interest rate. I put 0 in quotes because, as you probably know, the Fed doesn't want to go to 0, never did go to 0, but went very low, and promulgated an alphabet soup of lending facilities followed by quantitative easing. This was the first time in decades that monetary policy felt it needed help from fiscal policy. It wasn't going to be able to do the job by itself. We had the worst recession since the 1930s. Andrea is telling me I have 5 minutes left, I think, and I'm going to wrap up quickly. The Recovery Act passed at the beginning of 2009, thought to be a massive fiscal stimulus, looked small compared to what happened in the pandemic, and may have been too small. But the Republicans, John Boehner was Speaker of the House at that time, were calling this job-killing government spending. Once again, the idea that the fiscal multiplier is negative, not positive. And that was followed up by fiscal contraction of about 1.5% of GDP per year for 3 years running. Think about that. This is an economy that's limping out of a very deep recession. And fiscal policy is turning contractionary for 3 years in a row, despite President Obama and Fed Chair Bernanke urging Congress not to do that. I come next and almost to the end to Trump, who started his administration with, yes, of course, another, quote, supply side tax cut in an economy we thought was fully employed. This reminded a lot of people of what Johnson did in '65. When he was a candidate, Trump berated Fed Chair Yellen for being too loose. And then after he put Fed Chair Powell in office, when he was president, he berated Powell for being too tight. And again, asked about firing Powell, and he got the same answer that LBJ got. He supported Congress's gigantic fiscal stimulus, the CARES Act, which was over 10% of GDP. Remember, the Obama Recovery Act was only about 5% of GDP. The Fed, for its part, did everything it could. It brought back the old lending and liquidity facilities, added a lot more of them. Interestingly, some of this was kind of mandated by the CARES Act, which represented a small incursion into Fed independence, which had not happened in 2008. But in any case, we did get both fiscal and monetary policy pressing the pedal to the metal to try to get the economy growing again. And late in 2020, this was followed by another stimulus package. Trump wanted it to be bigger. It became an election issue. The only reason I mention that is that it was a major component of Biden's American Rescue Plan to add another round of $1,400 checks to the pre-existing fiscal stimulus. And that has been criticized. It was criticized at the time and since as being too large and a contributor to inflation in the United States. Notably, the Fed did not act to offset it with tighter monetary policy. So this was not a repeat performance of Reagan and Volcker. And in fact, as you all know, the Fed didn't start raising interest rates for another year. A policy error by almost anybody's assessment, including the Fed's looking back, that they made a mistake then. And importantly, Biden has resumed Clinton's hands off the Fed rhetoric. You don't hear that phrase, "we don't comment on the Fed," which was the theme of the Clinton administration. But they don't comment on the Fed. You can't think of a leader or a prominent person in the Biden administration who has said anything about the Fed other than respecting the Fed's independence. Even though Biden certainly could have made a good intellectual case that the reason we have this inflation was that the Fed goofed, not that the fiscal authorities goofed. But you didn't hear any of that from Biden. So to summarize very quickly the three themes that I highlighted at the outset. Do we do stabilization policy mainly by monetary or fiscal means? Back in the beginning, it was fiscal. By the end, it was clearly monetary, although both were cooperating. And in between, there were a lot of ups and downs, and that's a major theme of what I've been talking about. attitudes toward the budget deficits moved more monotonically. At the beginning of the 60-year period, they were thought terrible, immoral, ruinous, whatever. By the end, I don't know how many people are old enough, I am, to remember Alfred E. Newman on Mad Magazine, whose motto was, "What, me worry?" These days, nobody seems to be worried in the US about very large budget deficits. And finally, central bank independence, which was an afterthought, if it was even a thought, back in the days of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, is now thought to be critical to getting macroeconomic policy right. And that has been mostly rising support for central banking. That's what CBI is, central bank independence, since then. Times have changed in 60 years. And that's the end of my story.
Thank you very much, Alan, for this interesting presentation and perfect timing. Pato, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Let you know a little early before that.
Okay. Okay. I was thinking to make comments on 3 issues: stagflation, financial crisis, and the fiscal deficit, national debt. However, given the time restriction, I'm going to talk only about the financial crisis. And before doing that, let me say with respect to stagflation that in spite of Milton Friedman's dictum and monetary belief in the classic dichotomy, supply-price shocks generated higher inflation in the 70s. In short, stagflation hurts the Keynesian-Phillips relationship, the Milton Friedman dictum about money as the only factor generating inflation, and also monetarist belief in the classic monetary real dichotomy, which is wrong. But let me go to the financial crisis. Alan Blinder provides a very interesting and highly detailed and easy to follow explanation of the 2007-2009 USA financial crisis, and he provides the sequence of bank and financial institution bankruptcies, etc. There were many signs prior to 2007 that there were 2 bubbles developing separately in the house price mortgage market and in the gigantic and multidimensional bond stocks and complex financial tools like the derivatives. Mountain of the derivatives were built atop mortgage-related securities. Derivatives are defined as financial weapons of massive destruction. By 2012, derivatives contracts were 9 times the global GDP, the largest financial transaction of the world. Oh. Wow. I'm sorry. The problem here.
It's okay like that. We see it's fine. Okay.
Queen Elizabeth asked a fundamental question. Why nobody anticipated this awful financial crisis? The USA Federal Reserve did not see what was going on. Alan Greenspan, the greatest central banker in history, found it implausible that sophisticated financiers would take crazy risks they didn't understand with their company's money. Modern management techniques based on the theory of efficient, perfect financial markets were high-tech safeguards against any sort of negligence. Mortgage-based securities were sliced into tranches of varying degrees of risk. Through the magic of tranching, financial gurus, PhDs in physics and math, made risk disappear. Quantum mechanics theory was very useful to do that. However, real economic risk cannot be eliminated by repackaging financial assets. There are two key questions related to the financial sector. Why the financial sector is different to the sectors producing goods and services? What makes the financial sector so unstable? The financial sector links decisions taken today that produce an outcome tomorrow. The financial sector has to deal with uncertainty with respect to the future. Transactions in the financial sector are based on intuitions and expectations. Capitalism is prone to have expansive and contraction cycles, boom and bust. Crises were induced and nurtured by the financial sector. The hypothesis of financial instability of capitalism states that an unregulated banking and financial sector with little supervision can generate severe crises like the Great Depression and the awful financial collapse of 2007. The theory of efficient, perfect financial markets used by Wall Street dealers, the PhDs in physics and math, elaborated complex indicators and models that nobody understood. But the bottom line message was that they had certainty with respect to the future. They were the prophets of the financial sector, highly efficient for the allocation of investment, but who knew little about economics and transformed the financial sector into an unregulated casino. When there was a period of high positive economic growth, financial sector stimulated an expansive cycle that eventually became a boom, generating euphoria. Everyone wanted to be rich quickly. The boom becomes a speculative bubble where everyone thinks that the prices of houses and stock can increase permanently. But why prices of houses and stocks were increasing all the time? Most of the people didn't know, but they thought that the prophets and bankers of the financial sector knew. What's more, they also didn't know. What they did know was when the music stops in terms of liquidity, things will be complicated. But as long as the music is playing, you have got to get up and dance. We're still dancing, said Charles Prince, the CEO of Citigroup, on July 2007. And Prince's explanation for keep dancing was, it was a race to keep us with competitors who kept loosening lending standards, and Citi couldn't afford to drop out. How is it possible that so many economists, bankers, and financial sector experts thought that they had found the crystal ball predicting the future? The 2007 financial collapse provides the empirical rejection of the theory of efficient, perfect financial markets. Question for Alan Blinder. Since financial shocks are important for generating macro instability, when is the next financial crisis going to happen? Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models are used by many central banks. are these models useful or useless for predicting the next financial crisis? If the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models do not include the interaction between the financial sector and the real economy, nor consider bubbles development, existence of speculative booms and crises, then how could these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models anticipate and predict the next financial collapse, shock? In short, what do you think? Are DSGE models useful or useless? Is it good for society's welfare to have too many financial transactions? Empirical evidence, frequent financial crises suggest to have strict regulations and permanent surveillance of the banking and financial sector. James Tobin recommends to put sand in the wheels of the financial sector machinery, and that's the Tobin tax. And there are several reasons, several economic reasons for the Tobin tax to financial transactions. I have listed them here, but my question is that in the book, there is no mention of Minsky financial sector instability hypothesis, nor of Tobin tax. And I ask to Alan Blinder, why? Well, I have 5 minutes. Okay, let me finish with the
No,
US.
you have one.
Just 1 minute? Okay.
So you can wrap up.
Yeah, in the European Union, legally fiscal binding rules were established in the Maastricht Treaty, 1992. Fiscal deficit should be below 3%. Public national debt should be below 60%. In the US, there are no rules and no limits neither on the fiscal deficit nor in the public debt. USA debate on the fiscal deficit was around its implication and the perceptions, as Alan Blinder put forward, have changed quite a lot. And like he put it on the book and he said it, at the beginning of the 60 years period, large deficits were considered dangerous and immoral. During the 21st century, they were viewed as mother's milk by all presidents. And here you have USA federal budget deficits that were of the order of 5% of GDP deficit most of the time. They increased to 10% after the financial crash, and they went up to 15% when we had the pandemic crisis. On the other hand, the US national debt, as you can see here, it was 100% of GDP during the Second World War, and it increased to 80% after the financial crash, and almost 100% again after the financial crisis. And let me finish with the last diapo. Okay, and that's a question to Alan Blinder. A Latin American country like Chile, which model should imitate? The European Union fiscal binding rules, or the USA no limits and no rules system, neither on fiscal deficit nor in the public debt? To finish, I strongly recommend reading and using Alan Blinder's book in macro courses. This book provides a deep analysis and understanding for the three-way interaction between economic theory, excluding facts, money policy making, and political actors. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Pato. Thanks a lot for your comments and lots of questions for Alan. You can stop sharing. So now Elias has the floor. Thanks again.
Thanks, Andrea. Thank you very much for the invitation. I apologize that I won't be able to turn on my video because I have a very unstable signal. And if you could stop, great. So I'll share my slides. Let me just begin by saying that it was great to have this opportunity as a very strong commitment device to read the book. I actually listened to the book in Audible, which has a very good narrator as well, so it's very easy to follow. And I think this book is a must read. It's a tour de force for several audiences. I think it will become basic reading for macroeconomics in academia, because it's an excellent account of the evolution of macro theory. Alan did not highlight this so much in his presentation, but this theme is very prominent throughout the book. It's also a required reading for central bankers, I think, as it has a fascinating discussion on how events and personalities also have shaped and radically transformed the role and the application of monetary policy. And for policymakers more generally, it's a very insightful guide on how politics and macroeconomic policy have interacted and influenced one another. There's several core themes in the book. I'll be fast on this because Alan, I think, did explain this quite well. First, one core theme is the evolution of macroeconomic theory. Essentially, I think the message, a very fair message that comes from this book, is that in academia, Keynesian thinking has had ups and downs, but has survived with obviously modifications, and today is the core macroeconomic theory. And at the same time that these oscillations between the popularity or unpopularity of Keynesian thinking, what's going on in academia, in central banking, thankfully, it was always the implicit framework driving decisions. And here the word implicit is important because some Federal Reserve chairs were more vocal on this, but in terms of the decisions that they followed, for the most part, you can clearly see a Keynesian paradigm driving these decisions. Another core theme of the book is the mutual influence and sometimes lack of influence that there is between theory and practice. And there are a bunch of very interesting episodes. For example, one that illustrates well the link between theory and practice is the first use of fiscal policy as stabilization in the 60s, as Alan mentioned. Also, the conviction by Volcker that monetary policy has the potential and should be used to reduce inflation according to the new Keynesian paradigm, and it was used and it worked. There's also very interesting examples on how sometimes the practice influences the theory. The oil price shocks were mentioned in the presentation, and also this very interesting episode where Clinton announces a very large deficit reduction in the future, and that deficit reduction through the channel of expectations and the role of lowering down bond yields throughout the yield curve essentially stimulated the economy. So what seemed to be a negative fiscal multiplier actually should be understood in a different way. And it's one of these explanations where, or one of these situations where innovations in what's going on in practice really influences how we understand macroeconomic theory. Another theme in the book is how the relative roles of monetary policy and fiscal policy have evolved through time. This was highlighted by Alan, so I'll skip this. And finally, how central bank independence and communications have changed dramatically. Let me just emphasize a key lessons that I learned from the book, a few of them. Some were insights that I kind of had already, but it was nice when they're confirmed and they're put into perspective. And here, let me just illustrate a couple. First, that rigorous theory is of course essential, but oftentimes it can get quite silly. and this is a valuable message for young academics that, you know, when writing papers and trying to shape your, push your way in your academic career, it's always good to have one foot or hopefully both feet on the ground, and don't get you know, attracted by these conceptual theories that really have very little down-to-earth application. Another insight that's very relevant is that central bank independence is not a given. This has been earned, and it has been earned through both competence, but also determination of the key figures that appear throughout Alan Blinder's story. Another insight is that the views towards deficit and debt have changed substantially, especially for the Republican Party. And finally, one insight that also was confirmed that I think we cannot fail to mention is that bad economic theory, like for example, this idea that from supply side economic that tax cuts can pay for themselves, can be surprisingly persistent in the discourse and can be completely immune to logic and also empirical evidence. And the point to emphasize here is that they can be eagerly imported by other countries. So I remember having or listening to the discussion in Chile as well, and in not too far in the past elections, where some candidates, they basically make this case that if we lower taxes, the economy is going to recover so strongly that in the end, the tax base is going to increase and we'll collect more taxes. So I think it's a very important message from this book, that this is a flawed theory, is not supported by any empirical evidence whatsoever. But despite that, people just keep repeating it because it has become a political argument. What are the new insights that I did not really had incorporated before? And I thank the author for being very clear on this. First, that the use of fiscal policy as a stabilization tool is quite recent, and it's inaugurated in the early 60s, basically. And second, that the natural predisposition that arises in politics to use it asymmetrically is much easier to approve tax cuts or expenditures than the reverse. It has led in practice to such a buildup in debt that fiscal policy cannot be used at this point for stabilization purposes. And I think this point was very forcefully made in the book, and it's a valuable point to take out from it. Let me just finish, Andrea, in maybe the minute that I have. Looking ahead, I also have some reflections, and let me start with the episode of Alan Greenspan. What Professor Blinder denotes the great call of Greenspan, which essentially was to anticipate that throughout his tenure, productivity in the US, from the influence of the adoption of information technologies, was increasing, and this was not yet evident in the data. And what Alan Greenspan basically took from that insight is that there was no necessity to keep increasing rates, despite the fact that unemployment seemed to be at or below what was thought to be the NAIRU at that point in time. So it's very important for central bankers to anticipate, or at least to react quickly when there are changes in structural relationships in the economy that imply that, for example, the NAIRU or the potential growth rate of output can change. And this is, of course, something that at the central bank we do quite often. This is essentially a key driver of our strategic research agenda. But I think the Alan Greenspan episodes really brings this to light. And given that, what are the main structural changes that we are facing, and how might this affect potential output? So I'll just give a few reflections, and hopefully Professor Blinder can comment on this. We see now that on the one hand, the IT revolution has permeated more strongly into actual production processes in recent years, essentially through automatization. And this should be, in principle, should increase productivity. But we also have other important forces pushing in the opposite direction. One of them, and I think this is very hard to deny at this stage, we are in the midst of a very severe breakdown of international cooperation and also international trade. And this is a reversal of a very strong force that probably explained the relevant share of the downward inflation trend that we observed in the last 20 years. So that is one force that probably will revert. And well, the natural consequence of this is that we might have the opposite trend in inflation. It's a possibility, certainly. And another important structural change is the environmental transition. which implies that material goods, food, energy may well become more expensive for quite some time, as we are forced to correctly price the environmental consequences that are implicit in our production and consumption patterns. So I guess where I'm going with this, I'll just finish with a question. What does this imply for central bank independence? We're in a situation where we were coming from an environment of very low interest rates, very low inflation, and this coincided with the buildup of debt, and nobody was concerned about this because it seemed that we were in a different equilibrium with very low interest rates. But for the reasons that I just mentioned, there is a non-negligible risk that we can see some reversal in these trends, and we can see an increase in inflation and an increase in the equilibrium level of interest rates. So my question, and I guess with this I'll finish. What happens if rates return to the historical ranges of 4 to 6%, say? Can governments really deliver the significant surpluses that are needed, are consistent with this all their relationships, all their levels of interest rates? And my impression is that politics have become much more toxic in many countries in recent years as a reflection of more polarized societies. So I think it's going to prove a lot harder for central banks to stop accommodating public debts and react if we see these changes. With this, I'm not saying that we're likely to lose central bank independence. I'm more likely saying that central bank independence with a relevant probability will be seriously tested in coming years. And let me just finish there because I think we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias, for your comments. I'm going to give the floor to Alan, who has lots of questions on his table. If I may, can I add one in the line of when Elias was saying now, whether you see if there's space for fiscal and monetary coordination, whether we should be setting up mechanisms, and if you can do that, keeping up with central bank independence. So you are the one who has time restrictions, Alan, so go ahead and take the floor on when you think it's okay to reply. Thanks.
Well, first, let me thank both of the discussants for their remarks, which are mostly complimentary. You know, I write a Wall Street Journal column every month, and I don't get mostly compliments on the email. I get told how stupid I am. So it was nice to hear that. Let me try to quickly go over some of the questions. Bertuccio started with that famous Chuck Prince quote, from which I took the title of a book that I wrote on the crisis after the music stopped. So I agree with all that. But to the specific question, I don't think the next crisis is predictable. When I talk about this topic in my class, one of my undergraduate classes, I always bring up the metaphor of Wile E. Coyote, the cartoon character, the roadrunner who runs off chasing the roadrunner, who runs off the cliff and then hangs there for a while. And then after a few seconds, boom, down to the ground. Why exactly then? Nobody knows. We still don't know, for example, why the 1987 stock market crash happened when it did. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to predict these things. As to your specific question of whether the DSGE models help us in that, the answer is no. You more or less gave that answer yourself, but I think the answer is certainly no. You asked about limits on debts and deficits. Everybody on this Zoom knows more about Latin America than I do. But based on what I do know, I would have thought that they are much more advisable in Latin America than they are in the United States. We have one stupid thing in the United States which causes us difficulties regularly, which is a ceiling on the national debt. There's no ceiling on how much deficit you could run, which is a promise to raise the debt. But on top of that, we have this ridiculous numerical ceiling on the national debt. It would be much better to get rid of that. But in the Latin American context, Chile is usually pointed out as an outlier on the good side of this. But in much of your continent, fiscal discipline has been sorely lacking over the decades. Elias talked also about anticipating major events like changes in the productivity trend. I think that's something between hard and impossible, and my evidence for that is economists have never been able to predict them, whether it was an increase in the productivity trend or a decrease in the productivity trend. He then mentioned intelligently, correctly, that if you can't do that, reacting quickly is the next best alternative. And that's right, but I would say, having served on the Federal Reserve and been around central bankers for more than a quarter century, it's kind of counter-cultural in central banking to react quickly. Central bankers are used to taking their time, thinking about it, analyzing it, coming to studied decisions rather than reacting quickly because of the danger that a quick reaction may not be the right reaction. So that's something to shoot for, but I think difficult to actually achieve. And then the last question Elias ended with, I think, is a good one. And the question was, will countries be able to achieve budget surpluses when interest rates go back up, maybe to where they are now in the United States, or maybe higher in many other countries, and the interest, the debt service on the accumulated debt will be quite large. I think that's going to be quite difficult. The only thing I would say for that is that we want to remember that having a budget surplus is not really an important goal of budgetary discipline. Having a deficit that is small enough so that the debt to GDP ratio doesn't skyrocket and in the limit doesn't go up is a much more sensible target, and we may be able to reach that one. So let me stop there. Oh, and Andre asked about coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. I would say it varies from country to country. In the United States, I think we're only likely to see it in a serious crisis, where we have seen it after the financial crisis and after the pandemic crisis.
Thank you, Alan. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and thank you very much, Patricio and Elias, also for this fascinating conversation. You gave us a lot to think about. So, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you here, Alan. Thank you, Patricio. Thank you, Elias. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.